Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. You're very welcome to this session called The Bedrock of Inclusion, the case for investing in teachers for delivery of Sustainable Development Goal number 4. We're really delighted that you've chosen this session. It's going to be really exciting. We've got a really rich program for you today, with some really excellent panelists, discussants, who are going to talk about a range of issues around this topic on investing in teacher education. I just want to go through a few house rules. We really would like to hear from you, and could you please, if you have some questions, because the second part of our session will involve answering some of your questions, is to share some of those questions through the chat. And those will be fed to me, and I'll ask them on your behalf to our panelists. If you have any pressing questions, I can also look at those while we're having our first session of discussions. So, as I said, the session is around a report that was sponsored by NORAD, and we're going to hear some really interesting findings from this in relation to Sustainable Development Goal 4. Now, I just remind you that Sustainable Development Goal 4 is for inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So that's the sustainable goal that we are. My name is Dr. Paul Lynch. I'm a senior lecturer in inclusive education at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. And I'm really delighted to convene this session. Teacher education and children with disabilities are two very important themes close to my heart, also to my research. I'm delighted that we have panelists from countries that I've worked in, for example, in Malawi, where I've done a lot of research on disability teacher education. And I'm really delighted we have representatives from there. I'm also delighted we have representatives from other parts of Africa, and I'll introduce our panelists in a few moments. So the focus, so I'm delighted to convene this panel, which is focused on study findings from 5 African countries. The 5 countries are Ethiopia, Malawi, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Tanzania. And what we're going to do is highlight specific teacher financing and the impact this has on the 5 countries' ability to deliver disability inclusive education. So whilst the scope of the discussion will focus on the commonalities and challenges specific for the 5 countries, it will also acknowledge and highlight relevance of many of these issues to other countries working towards the achievement of Sustainable Goal number 4. So this session aims to use the research findings to raise awareness of the importance of investing in teachers to deliver disability inclusive education and achieve Sustainable Goal number 4. Engaging participants in the discussion around this issue and highlighting key advocacy messages for the for the G20 and for other leaders. A set of recommendations or call to action to the G20 and other leaders will collectively be agreed upon, and this will feed into the development of advocacy messages to be used by different organizations. So this discussion will hopefully amplify some of the key messages brought out in the report to promote inclusive education and meet the diverse needs of children with disabilities and guarantee access and quality and equitable education to all, and advance the Sustainable Goal number 4. This is increasingly important in the current backdrop of the pandemic, as disruption to learning has disproportionately affected those with disabilities. And I'm drawn to a discussion earlier. David Archer at ActionAid gave a really inspiring opening to a previous session which discussed the report. And his message was that we're not going to make a bedrock on inclusive education without financing teacher education. And I think that's a really key message. And I think that's going to be emphasized in our panel discussion today. So now I'd like to move on to introducing our presenters, our discussants. We've got an international panel. And I'd like to first of all introduce Julie Duma from ActionAid. Julie is a Global Education Program Manager for ActionAid International, and she's located in Malawi at the moment. She has a vast amount of experience in the education sector, she's worked at the Ministry of Education in Malawi and the development sector with ActionAid at country as well as global level, with a focus on girls' education, gender equality, and accountability for the right to education. Julie also has experience of leading networks as chairperson of the Civil Society Education Coalition, I think that's in Malawi, and Girls Not Brides Network in the Malawi, and contributed to the development of the SADC model to end child marriage. So I'd like to welcome Julie. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Asmara Fig, who's International Project Coordinator at ActionAid International as well. Asmara is an international development professional with over 15 years in the design, implementation, and management of education, child participation, and protection. Asmara has worked as a project manager, consultant, and technical advisor in Côte d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, Kenya, to name a few countries. Asmara has worked as coordinator for a multi-country project funded by the Norwegian Agency for Development and Cooperation. So thanks to Asmara. And thirdly, we're going to move to Solomon Shifero, who is in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. He's a secondary school teacher at Tikir Anbera Secondary School. Solomon teaches civic and ethical education to deaf high school students at Tikir Anbesa High School in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Solomon is deaf. He has worked for a local NGO called Rehabilitative Services for Deaf Association, which is also based in Addis, as a teacher of the deaf in an elementary school. Also, Solomon has a BA in civil and ethical education and has learnt about the educational needs of deaf children, advocating for the quality educational rights of the deaf. He serves as a youth representative for Light for the World at the Global Campaign for Education World Assembly in Nepal in 2018. And now I'd like to welcome Charles Kunchenga, who's currently the Secretary General of the Teachers Union of Malawi since 2017. As Secretary General, he has led the union in advocacy for the promotion of around 23,000 teachers. Charles also represents the Teachers Union of Malawi and is a board member of the Civil Society Education Coalition. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce you to Nafisa Babu, who is Director of Inclusive Education at Light for the World. She's a qualified speech and language therapist and audiologist. Nafisa has a great interest in inclusive education, policies and practices, and also advocacy work, and has a great interest in teacher training and education of officials and communities on inclusive education. Nafisa serves as a board member on the Global Campaign for Education and Technical Advisory Committee of the newly established Inclusive Education Initiative, and is former head of the Inclusive Education Task Group of the International Disability and Development Convention. So we've really got a rich group of people here, and I'm really looking forward to talking to them and asking some questions. And just to give a brief outline, I'm going to ask each panelist one or two questions. They've got about 5 to 6 minutes to respond to these questions. We're going to watch a small animated film briefly after Julie talks. And the second part, this will be around 40 to 45 minutes. And then we'll move on to audience questions or further questions that arise from the first set of questions. And then to conclude, I'll do some concluding remarks and talk about the next steps and tell you where you can get this really very interesting report that's been produced. So thanks for that. And now I'm going to pass on to our questions. And our first question I'm going to ask is to Julie. Julie, what is the global picture of financing for education? And how does this relate to the financing of teachers to deliver on inclusive education? Would you like to answer to that? And maybe also think about how, given the current pandemic, how has the financing of education been affected as a result of COVID-19?
So thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining from. It's a pleasure to be here too, and thanks to the C20 organizing team for inviting us to this session. So to respond to the question about the financing of education and how it relates to the financing of teachers to deliver on inclusive education, I will start by stressing that there has been a chronic underfunding of public education systems, which means there have been continuous violations of the right to education. Unless there's a sea of change in financing, this could lead to a failure to achieve strategic development goal 4. So countries need to find substantial new domestic resources to fund quality education, and in particular related to the study that Paul talked about and which we launched on World Teachers' Day, inclusive education. So for a holistic view of some of the key changes that need to be made to ensure adequate financing to education, it's very useful to look at the issue through the lens of ActionAid and its partners for education financing framework that focuses on the 4 S's, that's the size, the share, the sensitivity, and scrutiny of allocations to the sector. So I will go through each one of these S's. So the share of the budgets spent on education is the first S. So the international benchmark on this one is 15 to 20% as per the Incheon Declaration. The second S is the size of government revenue overall. So countries should increase their tax to GDP ratio through fair and progressive tax. IMF and World Bank estimate that anything below 15% is insufficient to carry out even the most basic state functions. The average across sub-Saharan Africa is 17.2%, and this was in 2019. In the OECD countries, it was 34.2%. And in some Northern European countries, for example, in the Scandinavian region, it is upwards of 40%. So you can see that this demonstrates a stark difference in terms of the amounts available for governments to invest in public service delivery. So post-COVID, there's extra urgency for raising taxes in a fair and progressive way, including through setting new global rules for ensuring companies pay their fair share, raising taxes on excess profits and wealth, ending harmful tax incentives through which developing countries lose at least 138 billion a year. So preventing aggressive tax avoidance, which developing countries also lose at least 200 billion a year, and stopping illicit financial flows. So all these are important to ensure that the overall size of the budget is increases. As I mentioned in the first one, where we are talking about the share of the education budget, it's the recommended benchmark is 15 to 20%, but there are countries that are allocating more than 20% on the budget. But because the overall size of the country's budget is small, that size that is allocated to education is also, the share allocated to education is also small. So action on the size of the budget is important to increase that share of the budget that is allocated to education. The third S is the sensitivity, which the sensitivity of the allocations within education, focusing on equity. So education budgets need to actively support equity and inclusion. It's not enough just to allocate that amount to education without being sensitive in the way this is being allocated. And this is very important for the research that we have conducted on inclusive education. The final S is the scrutiny. So there's scrutiny needed to ensure that money arrives in practice. So more detailed data on disability, gender, and inclusion are required to enable monitoring of budget allocations to inclusive education and ensure that that money actually gets there. So I will also briefly highlight why this research is important. So we only there's just 10 years to go to the 2030 deadline for the strategic development goals. So it's important to take stock of current status of and the realistic requirements for investing in an education workforce able to support disability inclusive education, to provide the much needed evidence for countries to use to improve the provision of inclusive education to achieve strategic development 4. So unless substantial new funds become available for education, the level of financing required to transform education systems and the education workforce to deliver inclusion is likely to remain out. So I would like to highlight just 3 key lessons from the countries in the studies. We noted in the study that lack of robust and accurate data prevents adequate planning and budgeting for inclusive education. Because if the children with disabilities are not counted, they cannot be budgeted for. In all countries, teachers do not receive sufficient training to practice inclusion. So despite the progress that has been made, resources for education are currently sufficient to achieve inclusive education. So those are lessons that we have learned from this report, and we are hoping these some action will be taken on these. And just to emphasize that teachers play an important role in the delivery of education. So sub-Saharan Africa alone requires 17 million more teachers. However, countries are constrained with teachers they need because of IMF austerity, wage bill containment. For example, in a recent study conducted by ActionAid, in the past 3 years, the IMF has advised countries to freeze or cut public sector wage bills in 78% of low-income countries where data is available. So this has sometimes unintentionally blocked recruitment of urgently needed teachers, doctors, nurses, and other essential public service employees. The amount that countries are also spending on debt repayments is also restricting the fiscal space for recruiting additional staff, such as teachers. Therefore, investing in the education workforce is the bedrock of inclusion and critical to ensuring that all children, especially those with disabilities, enjoy their right to education. Well-trained and qualified teachers are at the forefront of this process, but they cannot work alone. They need support from well-qualified, well-trained education leaders, administrators, and support personnel such as therapists, psychologists, community-based rehabilitation workers, and specialists in Braille and sign language. This is key to an education system equipped to respond to children's diverse learning needs. So, Paul, with your permission, I will respond to the next question later. We would like to now play a short video that summarizes the study findings so that people have an overview of what the study is about. So can I request Asmara to play the video, please?
This is Sarah. Every child has the right to inclusive quality education. More than almost anything else, this is made possible by well-trained, qualified and supported teachers and education support personnel. Unfortunately, for millions of children like Sarah, education remains out of reach. Sub-Saharan Africa has the greatest shortages of teachers in the world. Teachers are often undervalued, struggle to make a living wage, and are not always sufficiently trained. Many lack the skills and knowledge to teach children with disabilities who are the most likely to be left behind. All too often, teachers work in overcrowded classrooms, sometimes with hundreds of children squeezed into rundown buildings or huddled under trees. Teachers and education support personnel are the bedrock of inclusion. But even when governments do prioritise education, they often don't allocate enough money to recruit and train the staff they need. Meanwhile, each year, billions of dollars are lost on unfair tax, harmful corporate tax incentives, and debt. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated inequalities worldwide, increasing the risk of exclusion for the most marginalised. And the looming financial crisis risks squeezing education budgets even more. Unless something is done, millions of children will be denied their right to education. A different world is possible. Governments must take action, and we can push for the changes needed to prevent money being lost each year to harmful tax incentives, evasion and debt, and make sure it is spent on recruiting and training teachers and education support personnel, so children get the education they need to help them fulfill their potential. Together, we can build a better, brighter future for all children. Tell your government to invest in teachers and education support personnel so no child is left behind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Julie, for a really enlightening introduction to the report and flagging up some really important concerns, which we're going to continue discussing during this panel discussion. And also, I would like to highlight that we have a Twitter feed at the end of the video. There's 2 hashtags, and it'd be great if people who are participating could post to them. Hashtag tax pays for education, and also hashtag fund education. So those are the 2 Twitter feed hashtags. Now I'm going to move to the next panelist on our panel. It's I'd like to ask questions to Solomon Shifero, who is a teacher from Tikur Ambessa Secondary School in Ethiopia. And we're very fortunate to have Iyasu, who is going to interpret Solomon's response. Thank you very much to both of you for participating in this really important discussion. So I'd like to ask Solomon the following question. Solomon, how can inclusive education improve outcomes for young people with disabilities? And how does inclusive education better prepare them for the future of work?
For children to have a bright future, They need a focus for children. In inclusive education, children are normally integrated to each other. There is a problem of discrimination and equal participation. Additionally, there is a problem on the lesson plan. Because the lesson plan is unplanned earlier and is not participatory. Some teachers might have some attitudinal problem. In terms of parents, they do not send their children to school. Therefore, in order for me to help me to change these practically, one issue I present is to create and to prepare a participatory lesson plan and inclusive lesson plan. To work with various stakeholders and look for some solutions. During some extra times out of school time, those back to school. Trying to convince parents so that they send their children to school. And the negotiation is possible to make practical inclusion. So I've been doing this so far. Was to bring those hidden children from their homes to school. If we make, then we can replicate the issue to the youth. This helps for the children and the youth to have a social environment and a structure. And they have equal participation in many other domains. Gradually, when they grow up, when they have access to the media and they can create a successful network. So without putting emphasis on the replication in the youth sector. So this model can also replicate to those age groups. The future, so this is interlinked from the bottom to up. I believe this works for all age groups. Employed in many domains like the courtroom and other government sectors. Opportunity and equity in the education sector as well. So this is a motivational for the youth. So if inclusive education becomes practically true, then we can create an equitable and fair working environment. So we can include also so I believe this can create a positive work experience. Thank you.
Solomon, thank you very much. You've really touched on some really important issues, and it sounds like you have a multi-role in you act as a teacher, advocate, counsellor, motivator for your pupils, your students, also for families, but also you have a very strong role in finding solutions to support students to transition to work. And this sort of this leads me to a follow-up question in terms of why do you think it's important to have teachers with disabilities within the education system? So why do you think it's important to have a deaf teacher or a blind teacher or other working in education?
Students with disabilities in inclusive education, they are motivators for the classroom. The teachers with disabilities are the one who can create a positive, motivating environment in the school system. Therefore, these teachers, they have a great role in the inclusive education system. In the process, it's impossible to practically show that inclusive is in practice. So it is when we show them that they do practically, they follow, they replicate ours. Sometimes some teachers, there are some people who say that teaching the students with disabilities is an extra job, so there must be an additional budget towards it. So it means that it's an opportunity. But those students with disabilities, after they're finishing their school and when they are employed, they know what to do towards inclusion in the in my classroom experience, I equally teach. I can motivate them equally. So I can use my voice for the hearing and my sign for the deaf students. So I fight for the perfection of inclusive education. The other additional thing is the sign language. It is like a backbone and also collect information. There are also blind students while we are working together. So my school is like role model that are enrolled. So it is important to create friendship. It creates a positive moral environment. No, it doesn't create any psychological problem. It also creates social motivation. Because without inclusion, so students with disabilities feel discriminated. But when they come to the regular school, it's great. So I have one research which I started. The word disability is creating some confusion among the non-disabled people. For the word, it refers to inability. So I'm thinking to rename these words to create some awareness. Perhaps I'm going to share you my findings in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solomon. And thank you very much to Yasu for helping to communicate your really important contributions. And it shows you've given some really rich examples of how important it is to make sure that we have teachers with disabilities, given the fact that you have such an important role in mentoring, in educating, in being friends, motivating, creating positive environments for students with disabilities. You understand children who are deaf, but you have much more broader role in supporting children with disabilities. And thank you very much for pointing out the misconceptions around disability is not an inability, and we can't stop saying this. We need to echo this again and again to those who don't understand what disability is about. So thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you. So now I'm going to move from Ethiopia to Malawi, go further down the continent to Charles Kunchenga. I'd like to ask you a question around investing in teachers to deliver disability inclusive education. So what do you think is important? What's the importance of investing in teachers to deliver disability inclusive education? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think investing in teachers to deliver disability inclusive education ensures the teacher motivation, as teachers will be able to handle different challenges experienced in handling students with different disabilities. And the next point is that availability of adequate teaching resources or teaching aids that will enable them effectively deliver quality education to students with disabilities in schools. Not only that, it also ensures increased availability of special needs teachers in public schools who will be able to support learning to students with learning difficulties in our schools. No discrimination against the students with disabilities in our schools, hence increase the enrollment and retention of such students with disabilities. So I think on that question, I have tried to respond to it.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question. So in terms of the Teachers Union of Malawi, how has the union that you represent as Secretary General been doing to advocate for inclusive education? And have you been engaging with government and other stakeholders on this particular issue around inclusion of children with disabilities?
Really, that's very true. And as Teachers Union of Malawi, TUM, has been promoting inclusive education in Malawi in many ways, such as we had been advocating for promotions of about 23,000 teachers, including special needs education teachers in 2019, which led to teacher motivation and reduced the teacher turnoff. Secondly, through our engagement with the Civil Society Education Coalition, TUM influenced the recruitment of all IPTE, that is Initial Primary Teacher Education number 12, teachers, and ensured they are immediately inserted on government's payroll, unlike before. And that happened with this EPT 12. successively advocated for the payment of all outstanding arrears for teachers accrued way back. That was 2010, and these arrears were paid in 2019. And these were paid even to those teachers who have special needs problems or special needs education teachers. Teachers Union of Malawi has ensured timely payment of teachers' leave grants and teachers' salaries in Malawi, unlike in the past, whereby or when teachers were paid in the next month. Through our educational programs like Star School, Teachers Union of Malawi has been advocating for the availability of adequate user-friendly school infrastructures that enable children with disabilities access education. Now, as we are talking right now, Teachers Union of Malawi is advocating for the training and recruitment of more special needs education teachers to increase the supply of such teachers in all the public schools. Teachers Union of Malawi, too, is lobbying for the government, through Ministry of Education for the increased availability of teaching and learning resources, including teaching resources for children with disabilities in schools. TUM, that is Teachers Union of Malawi, is also advocating for the special incentives for special needs education teachers in the country to attract more special needs educational teachers or specialized teachers, as well as ensuring they remain in the teaching profession. It is also advocating for the review of teacher training college curriculum to ensure that all teachers graduating from teacher training colleges have basic knowledge in special needs education. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Sounds like you're investing a lot of energy and time into lobbying, advocating for special education needs teachers, and also materials and resources. And this 23,000 teachers, SEN teachers, is a good start. And I look forward to hearing more about these outcomes, particularly with the new government in place and the Minister of Education. So hopefully you'll be able to lobby and do a really good job on that. So I look forward to hearing more about that. So thank you very much, Charles. Now I'm going to turn to Nafisa and ask her some questions around, so Julie talked about introduced a report and some really important key findings that came out of the 5-country study. So I'm going to ask Nafisa to really talk about the implications of those findings from the research and why they were important, and give us some sort of reasons why we need to move forward on them. So over to you, Nafisa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. You know, this has been really a great study where we looked and it gave some great insights on the education workforce and what was still lacking in it. So I will give a little bit of information around this on the key findings, but Asmara will actually do the bulk of that work, if that's okay. So for me, one of the key findings that stood out in the research and why it stood out for me was the fact that many inclusive education plans and strategies lacked credible costing. And credible costing attached to national inclusive strategies didn't really include estimates for a full transformation of the education workforce and seemed to be more aspirational and far below what the apparent needs are. So with better costing models on inclusive education are basically needed, and this must be based on a clearer overview of what the actual needs are and based on more credible disaggregated data. So there are actually ways to collect more credible data on persons with disabilities and household surveys. And particularly for children with disabilities, the Washington Group UNICEF Child Functioning Module is the agreed upon approach. But to implement this, we also need resources. And when children are counted, we know we have a better way of planning and making sure that strategies are adherent to the needs on the ground, and we have the right amount of teachers to support children with disabilities. So organizations like ours working in disability and development also for many years have a lot of experience in inclusive education and implementation knowledge. However, there's not been a lot of large-scale projects linked to research on cost-effectiveness analysis in our sector. They don't really exist because also lack of financing. And often people feel, well, it's better to just use the money to help a child. But with better cost effectiveness analysis studies, we can really provide that compelling data for policymakers on what works and what does not work. What are pragmatic steps towards using science? But these are basically pragmatic steps towards using scientific evidence to determine how to allocate limited resources between often bewildering recommendations on interventions and how, for example, to improve the education workforce. So, for example, does an additional cost involving recruiting and training specialized teachers to work in mainstream school or achieve the same impact or effect as maybe, or cost even less than training up regular teachers and incorporating disability inclusive education in all upcoming continuous professional development training? So these are some of the questions that governments are potentially asking. So besides basing spending on actual needs, costing also needs to address system-wide reforms such as budgets to increase the number of teachers in the education system and make sure they are remunerated well. Because when we have, this will help us to have a lower pupil-teacher ratio and improve motivation of teachers. So costing must also be, if we do this costing exercise, which is so critical, it's important that we have representation across the sectors and spectrum from teacher unions, teachers who are working in the education system at the moment, civil society organizations like ours working in disability inclusive education, representative organizations of people with disabilities. Because when we bring all of these organizations together to develop the costing, do this costing exercise alongside governments, we really will ensure that it's credible, accurate, and there's wide ownership.
Great, thank you very much, Nafisa. And building on your reflections on the report, I'd like to invite Asmara to answer the question around the obstacles for teacher financing. So Nafisa's pointed out some of the importance where we do need to invest. Could you give us what obstacles are for teacher financing?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thanks everybody. Good afternoon and good evening. And it's really exciting to be here and have this opportunity to be on this panel and share some of the key findings of the research. You just asked Nafisa to share what some of the key findings of the study were. She did, but I think, arguably the most important finding is also the one that Julie mentioned at the beginning of her intervention, which is that unless substantial new funds become available for education, basically the level of financing required to transform education systems and the education workforce to deliver inclusion is likely to remain out of reach. We also just heard from Solomon, and teachers like Solomon, teachers all over the world, are the bedrock of inclusion. That's why we've called our study the bedrock of inclusion, because without them, there is going to be no inclusive education. You can have all the ramps you want and accessible toilets and braille machines, but unless you have the teachers and unless you have the education support personnel, it's not going to happen. So Julie, and if you watch the animation, you mentioned the shortage of 17 million teachers across sub-Saharan Africa. That's a huge amount of teachers missing. And in fact, it's the region in the world that has the greatest teacher shortages in the world. So why is this? We mentioned the Action Aid and Partners 4S education financing framework, and she went into detail of what the S's were, the size, the share, the scrutiny, the sensitivity. But what I'd like to do, if we're looking at obstacles for teacher financing, is perhaps focus on the issue of the share of the budget allocated to education and how that relates to the size of the budget overall, and how these in turn, if not addressed, present obstacles for teacher financing, by giving you some examples or findings from the different countries where we carried out the study, which were Malawi, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Tanzania. So, if you think about, the global benchmarks for education financing, so it's either 4 to 6% of GDP or 15 to 20% of budget. So you might think, okay, if we're meeting that target, then we've got enough money. We should be able to have enough teachers, right? But that's not the case. So if you look at a country like Malawi or a country like Mozambique or even Ethiopia, for which, education is a top priority. Ethiopia spends the hugest amount of budget, I think, of any country in the world on education. It's 27% of their budget. So that's higher than 20%. And Malawi and Mozambique in 2018 allocated 23% and 17% of their national budgets to education. But it's still not enough. They've got extremely high pupil-teacher ratios, huge teacher shortages, and these result in overcrowded classrooms and very high levels of out-of-school children. So if you think of a teacher who's in a classroom and they've got 100, 150, 200 children to deal with, the needs of children with different learning needs, children with disabilities, they're not going to be sufficiently addressed in that 45 minutes that the teacher has, to teach whatever it is to the children. And Malawi has, I think it's one of the greatest teacher shortages in the world. It needs over 81,700 teachers in the next 10 years just to get classes down to 60 pupils to one teacher. So if you're a teacher, imagine dealing with that every day. So meanwhile, we know that Malawi's allocating a lot of money to education. So why isn't the money enough? Why do they still need over 81,000 teachers to bring their class sizes down? And that's where we need to talk about the size of the overall budget. So teacher-related costs, salaries, pensions, incentives, all of these things take up a huge amount of countries' recurring education costs. And to cover these costs, governments need regular, sustainable sources of funding. And one of the best ways to raise additional sustainable funding is through tax. And ideally, we're talking in this case about fair and progressive tax. So those that pay more, those that earn more, pay more, and so on. And to be really simplistic, the ability of governments to raise revenue from taxation can be seen or assessed by looking at their tax to GDP ratio. And I think Julie touched on the issue of tax to GDP ratios just now in her intervention. It's not like there's a one-size-fits-all benchmark that, if you achieve 20% tax to GDP ratio, you will be able to do such and such. Obviously, it depends on each country's characteristics. But what we do know is that where there's a sizable increase in the country's tax capacity, it's likely to really have a significant role in their ability to deliver basic public services and to achieve, in this case, the Sustainable Development Goals. So, so there's not like a one-size-fits-all, but what we do know is that anything under 50%, according to the IMF and often the World Bank, if you have a tax to GDP ratio lower than 15%, you're unlikely as a government to be able to cover more than the basic state functions. And in most of the countries that we're working with in sub-Saharan Africa, the tax to GDP ratio is under that 15% or just above it. And Julie mentioned like Nordic countries where it's over 40%, OECD countries where it's over 34%. It really shows that the more tax you're able to raise, the more you're able to invest that money in public services like education, and therefore have more money to invest in the staff, in the teachers that you need. So to give an example of Nigeria, so there's a huge lack of credible, reliable, up-to-date data in Nigeria, but there is one of the estimates that we're working with in our study is that Nigeria needs around 1.3 million teachers just for basic education. Nigeria also has the highest number of out-of-school children in the world. Again, we don't know how many, but it's somewhere between 10 and 13 million. Nigeria is also one of the richest countries in the world. Last year, it was Africa's largest economy. It's the continent's largest oil producer. Nigeria's tax to GDP ratio is the lowest in the world at 5.7%. So if you're thinking about a benchmark of 15%, and you're looking at the richest country in Africa, pretty much, either it's Nigeria or South Africa this year, that means that there's a huge amount of money going missing. It could be being spent on education. It could be being spent on recruiting and training and putting those 1.3 million teachers in place. So, you know, money is going missing. It could be being raised through tax. Meanwhile, all of the countries in this study, including Nigeria, are losing a huge amount of money each year to harmful corporate tax incentives. You watched the video, it mentioned tax evasion, tax incentives, debt, and so on. So to give you some examples of this, you know, in 2016, ActionAid did more research and estimated that Tanzania alone lost around $531 million to unnecessary corporate tax incentives, $1 million, okay? Nigeria lost around $3.3 billion. That's just to tax incentives granted to 5 major extractive companies. And the IMF also estimated that Nigeria could raise a whopping $8.3 billion just by eliminating some unnecessary tax incentives. And these are huge amounts of money. So all of this presents an obstacle, the amounts that governments can make available to investing in teachers. And that's why I'm saying this is one of the most important findings that we came up with in our study. Also, Julie mentioned debt, and I think Nafisa mentioned debt as well. Not only are all these countries losing huge amounts of money to tax, they're also losing huge amounts of money each year in debt repayments. And at least 3 of the 5 countries we focused on are considered by the IMF to be in debt distress, and they're spending over 20% of their annual revenue on debt servicing. Mozambique is spending 27%, Malawi is spending 20%. So that's like nearly as much as they're spending on education. They're spending just on repaying debts. So in addition to that, I think, you know, you've got the wage bill caps, the austerity policies. Julie mentioned that as well. You know, if you factor in all of these things, you know, the amounts of money being lost to tax incentives to corporations that are unnecessary, the debt, the amounts of money going into debt, the failure to expand the tax and revenue base in progressive ways, these are all huge obstacles. And if you do look at all of that against the current global economic recession resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, these present really serious obstacles to the financing of critical public services such as education and to teachers in particular. So I've probably gone on for quite a while, but I think these can be considered pretty much some of the main obstacles for teacher financing.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jasmara. I think you've really brought out a lot of really important points that you've from your research, and I really hope that whoever's listening takes this on board, actually communicates this to governments. And I know that we're going to talk a bit more about those recommendations and calls to action towards the end of our session. Just to say that the report is available on ActionAid's website, is that right? And Light for the World. So I really encourage participants to read the report and really take home some of these key messages, because from my experience of working in inclusive education, this is probably the first time we've really dug deep into numbers, into understanding the importance of GDP, tax evasion, and the importance of investment in teacher education. So this is a critical report and critical findings for now, and we shouldn't turn our back to it. Now I'm going to move on. We've got about 20 minutes, around 20 minutes now, and we've had some questions from participants. I'd like to ask the panelists a couple of questions that have come from out of our panelist discussions, and one of them is do you think technology which might have an impact on teaching could be used with special needs children rather than spending money on training teachers? I think that's an interesting question. Is there anyone who would like to respond to that question around technology? Could technology actually not replace, but contribute, assist in teaching children with disabilities, rather than investing completely in teacher education? Is there anyone who'd like to respond to that question? Nafisa, please.
I would just reiterate that technology can never, ever replace a teacher. And I think we should be clear on that, because there's been a lot of research around giving children tablets and seeing if they, and it can for sure improve or contribute as a learning and teaching tool. It can be useful, but it can never replace a teacher. And we must remember that we live in a context where lots of parents and families are illiterate, right, in a household. So now we are giving them a piece of technology to use, then they, and not being literate mean that they might not be able to use that technology. We're also in situations where the majority of a country of population are based in the rural area with no electricity and no Wi-Fi or internet connectivity. So technology is not the panacea. I just want to be clear. It definitely can help in terms of promoting access, providing materials more accessible, because lots of students don't necessarily have textbooks. So they are, it could be useful as a learning and teaching aid, but it could never replace a teacher. And we need human contact, right? This is what is important also in the learning and teaching process. It's not just about a machine being taught by a robot. I think that we are humans and we need that human contact to flourish, like Solomon says, to be a friend, to inspire. There's so much more to it that happens in the classroom, and as well as the social part of being with friends and developing friendships. We should never underestimate the importance of.
Thank you very much, Nafisa. Does anyone else add to that, or I'll move on to another question? It's like I'll move on to another question, which is, what would be some recommendations to civil society organizations, NGOs, governments, on accessing the right to education in conflict settings, specifically when focus is usually on safety, security, and meeting other immediate basic needs? So would you have any although I know this particular study wasn't focused on conflict settings, but perhaps there are some wider lessons, wider themes that we could share based on your findings that we could apply to conflict settings. Is there anyone who'd like to talk to that? Okay, Asmara, please.
Yeah, I can have a stab. Thanks for the question, because obviously education in emergencies is, it's critical. It's a fundamental human right, and it's often one that is, or for many years was relegated not to the second plan. People think about emergency situation, they think about shelter, safety. But for the community of people who've been working in education emergencies for years, they will understand that providing education in emergencies for children provides regularity, it provides normality, it provides that sense of hope as well for the future. So it is critical. And I think what is crucially important is for the global community to prioritize the provision of education in emergency settings and to continue to prioritize the provision of funding for education in emergency settings, because I don't have the figures off the top of my head now, but it is traditionally, typically, one of the most underfunded sectors in emergency response, despite a huge amount of advocacy over recent years by the INGO sector and other activists for education. And obviously, as we're talking about inclusion, ensuring that any response, any education emergencies response is sensitive to factors such as gender and disability is crucial, because these are the children that even in non-conflict settings are the most likely to be left behind, are the most likely to be without opportunity. So making sure that those responses are adequately funded and that they are inclusive to the most marginalised children, I think is vital.
Thank you very much, Asmara. That's really helpful in terms of sharing some of the findings. I think that there are questions around, particularly at the moment with the current pandemic, where to allocate funding and security, also food security, other issues are very prominent, and so the worry is that teacher education or investing in teachers may be pushed down in terms of priority, but hopefully we can keep the pressure on IMF, other organisations, to make sure that they don't neglect it. I have a question regarding the investment of teachers. Should we focus our attention on providing teacher training to all teachers so that they have some idea, some initial understanding of how to support children with disabilities in mainstream? Or should we be focusing more on supporting something that Charles mentioned about special needs teachers or specific teachers who know about how to teach Braille, sign language, and providing incentives for those teachers? So when governments need to make a choice about budgeting, where do you think their priorities should be? Should they be budgeting to make sure that all teachers have a sort of very basic understanding of special education needs and disabilities? Or should we be in specialist teachers? Is there anyone who'd like to respond to that? Or will I put people on the... I see Nafisa might be interested. Go ahead.
I mean, if I prefer my other colleagues to take it over, but I really feel that it's not at the moment. I think it's hard to say either or, right? But I do feel in the past, teacher in general pre-service teacher training, there was no training on inclusive education or disability inclusion or special needs incorporated. There was no module on that. So teachers used to think, this is not my job, right? Wasn't trained in it, not my job. And I think and over the years, it's been a consistent recommendation by UNESCO and everyone that we should make sure that all pre-service teachers get a module, a mandatory module on inclusive education, special needs education, so that when they do step into the real world in a classroom, they are able to respond to that diversity. So this, I feel, is critical. So moving forward, yeah, I think it's not, we probably need to take a twin track approach around this because we don't have the evidence yet around it. So it makes logical sense that we make sure that all in-service teachers do receive training, but we should recognize that they will always need some additional support. And that additional specialized support needs to come from somewhere. And that's where I think the role of specialized teachers like Solomon and others would be useful. And you cannot expect a regular teacher to be also sign language fluent after a 3-week training. I mean, makes absolutely no sense. It's like teaching German after 3 weeks of learning German to a classroom. No, so I think these are things that we have to be mindful about, what is sensible to do. But for sure, moving forward, we need to make sure if someone's getting new additional training on mathematics, on approaches in literacy, we need to say this approach you can adapt it for a child with a hearing impairment or visual impairment in this way, and it's also beneficial for all children, and how the adaptation helps so many other children. Because I think this is how we can make sure normalize inclusion and make people see also the reality is that lots of these special needs approaches of the past of teaching to the level of the learner, all of that are actually inclusive approaches that come from special education. So I think it's important to bear in mind that we moving forward that all teachers need some sort of basic training for sure, and moving forward, continuous professional development needs to explain how all approaches are responding to the diverse needs of all children. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that response. And I remember I did some research into itinerant teachers or specialist teachers, and I think in Malawi, Uganda, and Kenya, but there was much of it was dependent upon NGOs supporting it, and convincing the Ministry of Education to take ownership was quite difficult. And so there was a problem in terms of, do you invest? There was a lot of extra investment in supporting teachers, itinerant teachers working with children with vision impairment, and very little in other areas. So there was a discussion about how much money should be spent on just training teachers with children with visual impairment. So there was quite a lot of controversy. So in terms of just checking to see if there are any other questions. So I think sort of moving back to some key recommendations for civil society. I think we're moving towards the final part of our session, but I think it's really important that we emphasize some of the recommendations that need to be picked up by the government. So I'd like to ask, and I think, Nafisa, you've got some key points to make in terms of what civil society can do to ensure these recommendations are picked up by government, and an important call to action. So I'll hand over to you again.
Education is and should be everybody's business. And I think that moving forward, advocacy groups across sectors, and also marginalized groups such as persons with disabilities, Indigenous people, we all need to band together to push governments to address things like tax evasion, harmful tax incentives, and country indebtedness. As Mara said, countries are spending too much money on debt. Mozambique, 27% of their budget is spent on debt servicing. And the average citizen doesn't know how much debt a country has, where it comes from, how much is spent on debt servicing. And all this money lost to debt servicing and harmful tax incentives and tax evasion is by large multinational companies are making it impossible for governments to deliver on essential public services, which are in effect denying girls and boys around the world their right to education. So we need to make this information more transparent, okay? Transparency is about budget allocation, expenditure, corruption is essential. It's the only way that we as civil society can hold governments accountable. We also need to educate the public through media and enroll their support for this cause. These issues need to be made more public. So we need to go beyond preaching to the converted. We also need to get ministers on finance on board to understand, the long-term ramifications of not investing in inclusive education and compulsory education. Often people think, okay, investing in tertiary education is so much more important, and because there are quick wins, right? Employment, instead of looking at the long-term vision. So I'm part of and all of us here are actually part of the Global Campaign for Education. And this is the largest civil society movement advocating for the right to education, holding governments accountable to deliver SDG4, and to bring education actors around the world together. There are national coalitions in every country, regional bodies as well, and we push also these issues like progressive taxation also on a global level. The injustice is only made clearer when we see, I want you to stress, like as Mara was talking about how many teachers could be employed with money lost in Nigeria. These injustices are only made clear if people understand what the amount of money is, lost and what it could be used for in terms of teachers and textbooks. So I like that we made that analogy, and I think those will help the general public to understand how big this issue really is. We also need to advocate to donor governments. Also, governments are here at the G20 to invest more in education, to pay their to provide their share of ODA towards education, and to support the global campaign, the Global Partnership for Education. The replenishment is coming up soon, as well as Education Cannot Wait, and make sure that low-income countries are provided with the money needed to be able to develop inclusive education systems to support girls and boys with disabilities. And that also means looking at things like debt cancellation and helping countries to improve their taxation processes. So those are just some of a few of those examples. We have a call to action, and I think it's even more important now during the COVID time. So as we see that that budgets will be squeezed, and we actually owe it to children who have paid the biggest sacrifice for their elders in this COVID pandemic by having school closures and I think that for this reason, we really need to step up and invest more in the education workforce and in education overall. So we are calling on governments basically now to safeguard financing on education and invest in the education workforce to deliver quality education, particularly for the most marginalized. So the things that we are asking for are to increase the size of the overall budgets through progressive taxation, to spend at least 20% of the budget and 6% of GDP on education, to address the amount lost each year to debt servicing, and to ensure that funds allocated to education arrive on time to where it's most needed, and that's equitable finance. So amidst this whole COVID pandemic, and which is not just a health crisis, it's an education crisis. We really need to stand together, all activists in all sectors. We need to do this now more than ever to safeguard the education of children and ensure a better future for all.
Nafisa, thank you very much. I think you've really spelled out some really key action points that we need to spread and share, and hopefully our audience will pick this up. And please use social media. I know Twitter, I've been checking Twitter, there's some really good tweets taking on, and we need to continue this discussion, not just now, but for the next year or so, because it's critical that we make sure that the findings and recommendations from this report are not just put on a shelf, but are actually disseminated and communicated more widely. So we're sort of to the end of our stimulating panel discussion on our report, and also on the importance of investing in teachers to support children with disabilities. Also, the importance of inclusive education. I hope that the audience has a greater understanding, if you did not know inclusive education or the importance of investing in teachers who are in the front line, our frontline workers who are we really depend on these teachers, families, communities. Often we turn to teachers as the first people to help support us, to make sure that children go to school and remain at school and have the right to go to school. And I think what we're showing in our discussion through different partners, we've had testimonies from a teacher, a deaf teacher, a really strong advocate for deaf education, and also ensuring that young people who are deaf go into work and prosper and thrive as individuals. General secretary of a teachers union who's working tirelessly to make sure that the government is listening to the union and ensuring that teachers, special needs teachers, are placed into schools, and that greater investment is placed in teachers. And also from representatives of two very important non-government organizations, Light for the World and ActionAid, who are working tirelessly again to support inclusive education. And the importance of funders like NORAD, who see again the importance of spending time and funding to ensure that we get the right information about disability and inclusion. So it just leaves me to allow Julie. I'll leave the floor open so that Julie and Charles could make some closing remarks. So Charles, would you like to make some closing remarks before we start? Thank you.
I think I don't have much to say. Otherwise, my statement is just short, just to say thanks a lot that as the union, we are encouraged to keep on knocking on government's door so that we should be listened. And we should also make sure that at least the special needs or disability teachers are recognized in all sectors in education. So we'll keep on doing that, and we'll be much focusing on the funding or the monies which are released to the Minister of Education, so that at least the government should be prioritizing all these teachers. I think by motivating teachers, more especially with disabilities, that will assist to have at least quality education in our country and globally. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Charles, for those really important words that were taken up. Judy, would you like to make any final remarks?
Yes, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much all the panelists for a very good session. I would like to highlight two issues. First of all, just to highlight that this report was a collaboration of 3 organizations. So we've talked a lot about ActionAid and Light for the World, but we also have Education International. So Education International was represented in this panel by Charles from the Teachers Union of Malawi. So just to mention that report is also found on the website of the Education International. So you can find it on the website of ActionAid, website of Light for the World, as well as the website for Education International. And I would also like to appeal to our participants today to take some time and read the report. It's very important that you read this report so that you have a deeper understanding of what is contained in the report. In our panel, we were not able to go into all the details that are in the report, as we had launched this report on World Teachers Day, which was on 5th October. And we would like to appeal to you to join us in the advocacy that we are doing on financing of disability inclusive education and the support to ensure that the teachers required to implement disability education is achieved. And you have seen our call to action, so please join us in ensuring that we reach as many of the country governments as possible. This research was focused on the 5 countries, as earlier mentioned, but the findings relate to apply to other countries as well. So we would really appreciate joining hands in doing advocacy on this. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Julie. I'd just like to invite Solomon just to say a final couple of remarks, then Asmara, and then we'll stop. Solomon, would you like to say concluding remarks?
Advocacy is important in this process. Regarding the SDG4, to make it perfect, so we need a collaborative efforts, regular meetings, and I recommend regular meetings and working in partnership. That's my hope. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Solomon. Yes, working, I think that's really key, is partnerships, and we haven't just talked about that. So thank you very much for raising that important aspect of working together through partnership. And we've just got a final couple of minutes. Asmara, would you like to, any concluding remarks you'd like to contribute?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, a lot has already been said, but I think it's critical, if we're tending towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially Sustainable Development Goal 4, which emphasizes inclusion. If we want to leave behind, then we need to understand that children with disabilities are amongst the most likely to be left behind. Despite the lack of concrete, reliable data, what we were still finding across all the 5 countries, that children with disabilities are the most likely to be out of school, and the majority of children with disabilities are still out of school. And unless we invest in teachers, unless we recruit more teachers, we train more teachers, we bring those pupil-teacher ratios down, we have teachers who are trained and understand how to respond to some of the learning needs of children with disabilities, those children will still be left behind. So if you're a Twitter user, tweet your Minister of Finance, tweet your Minister of Foreign Affairs, tweet whoever, tell your government to invest in teachers and education support personnel, and the hashtags that we're using are tax pays for and fund education. Read the report and really understand the connection between financing, tax, debt, and getting those children into school through qualified teachers. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Asmara. And that just leads me to thank all of you participants. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found this stimulating, and I would like to thank our panelists very much for their time and their contributions. Please have a good afternoon, evening, morning, and look forward to seeing you another time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.